I have never been interested in looking wealthy. This is not a moral position, or not primarily. It is more a practical one, arrived at early and held consistently across the years in which I was building something real. I drove a sensible car. I lived in a house that was comfortable but not conspicuous. I wore clothes that were clean and appropriate and entirely forgettable. I did not talk about money at dinner parties or charity events or the various social gatherings that my wife Claudia collected the way other people collect hobbies. I listened at those gatherings. I ate the food and drank moderately and smiled at the right moments and said very little that anyone would remember the next morning, and I came home and I went to work and I built. What I built carefully and over a long time and in structures that were not designed to impress anyone. They were designed to work. There is a difference between these things, and it is the difference between architecture and decoration, and I have always been more interested in architecture. Claudia had understood this about me, or I had believed she understood it, in the early years. She had appreciated, or appeared to appreciate, the stability underneath the understatement. She was a woman who had grown up in a family where appearances were everything and the substance behind them was always thinner than it looked, and she had told me once, in a moment of the genuine intimacy that marriages contain in their early chapters, that what she loved most about me was that I was real. That what you saw was what was there. That there was no gap between the surface and the foundation. She had not understood. I came to realize later that the surface I presented was not the full picture of the foundation. She had taken my quietness about money to mean the absence of it. She had looked at the sensible car and the comfortable house and the forgettable clothes and drawn the conclusion that seemed logical from the evidence available. She had not asked questions that would have complicated this conclusion, partly because she was not, at her core, curious about how things worked, only about how they appeared. And I had not volunteered information that she had not asked for, which was my own quiet failure in a marriage that contains several. We were together for 11 years. I do not want to reduce those 11 years to the divorce that ended them, because that would be dishonest, and because there were real things inside those years, real warmth, real shared experience, real love of the kind that is ordinary and sustaining rather than dramatic. We had built a life together in the visible sense. Dinners and vacations, and the particular rhythms of two people who have learned to move around each other in a shared space. There was a daughter, Maya, who was 8 when everything fell apart, and who is the irreducible fact of those years, the thing that remains when everything else has been recalculated. But Claudia had been unhappy for a while before she told me, and when she told me, she had already been talking to a lawyer for 6 weeks. I learned this later, the 6 weeks. She had gone to her lawyer first and to our marriage second, which told me something about the ordering of priorities that I have never entirely stopped thinking about. She had gone to a lawyer named Gerald Marsh, who had a reputation in our city for aggressive divorce representation on behalf of moneyed spouses, which was its own signal. You hire Gerald Marsh when you are planning to take something significant. You hire him when you have decided that the process is going to be a competition and you want to win it. She had hired Gerald Marsh because she believed there was something significant to take. What she had not done, in all the years of our marriage, was understand exactly what that something was. She knew there was money, the house, the joint accounts, the comfortable life we had constructed together. She did not know about the rest. She had not asked, and I had not said, and Gerald Marsh, for all his reputation and his aggressive approach, had made the preliminary assessment that a man who drove a sensible car and wore forgettable clothes and had a wife who described him as modestly successful was probably modestly successful. They had decided I had no significant assets before they had looked for them. This was their first mistake. It was also, as it turned out, their last opportunity to settle this matter on terms that would have been more favorable to them than what actually occurred. She told me on a Sunday evening in March. Maya was at her grandmother's. Claudia had arranged this, I understood afterward, had sent our daughter away for the weekend before having the conversation, which showed more planning than I had credited her with in the moment. She sat across the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten 11 years of ordinary meals, and she told me that she had retained counsel and intended to file for divorce, and that she hoped we could make this as straightforward as possible. She used the word straightforward. I have thought about that word many times since. What she meant by straightforward was, I have a lawyer, I have a plan, I have already decided what I want, and straightforward means you accept the terms without making this complicated. I said I understood. I said I would retain counsel of my own. I said I hoped we could manage this in a way that protected Maya from the worst of it. All of this was true, and none of it revealed what I was thinking, which was, you have made a significant strategic error, and I am going to let you make it slightly further before I address it. The filing came 4 days later. I had my own attorney by then, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been recommended to me by a colleague and who turned out to be precisely the right person for the situation. Not aggressive in the Gerald Marsh mold. Something more effective than aggressive, thorough, patient, and possessed of a legal mind that worked like a very fine instrument, finding the precise point of application and pressing there with controlled and sustained pressure. I laid out my full situation for Patricia in our first meeting. All of it. Every entity, every holding, every structure, every account. I put the documents on her desk in the organized way I do everything, and I watched her read through them with the focused attention of someone who is recalibrating as she reads. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does Claudia's attorney know any of this?" "No," I said. "Does Claudia?" I considered this. "She knows I have a business. She knows we have the house and the joint accounts. She does not know the rest." Patricia looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. "Why not?" "Because she never asked," I said. "And because the structures I have built are not secret. They are all properly documented and filed and legally straightforward. They are simply not visible if you do not look for them." And no one looked. Patricia nodded slowly. "Gerald Marsh filed a preliminary asset summary with the initial petition," she said. "His estimate of your net worth is approximately $400,000. The house equity, the joint accounts, some retirement savings. 400,000. Against a reality that was more than 15 times that number. He's going to be surprised," I said. "Yes," Patricia said. "He is. The question is when we want that surprise to occur." This is the conversation that shaped everything that followed. We discussed timing. We discussed strategy. We discussed the legal landscape of full financial disclosure, which is required, and which I intended to comply with completely, because I have never had any interest in hiding assets from a court, only in waiting for the correct procedural moment to present them. Patricia explained the process. The mandatory financial disclosures would come at the deposition stage. Until then, Marsh's assumption would stand unchallenged. We let it stand. We let him file his preliminary documents with the confident arithmetic of a man who has counted someone's money and found it modest. We let Claudia's legal team build their strategy on the foundation of what they believed they knew. We responded to their initial proposals with measured, reasonable, non-committal language that gave them nothing to react to and everything to assume. And then the deposition date arrived. Gerald Marsh sent Claudia's initial settlement demand 2 weeks before the deposition. It was structured with the confidence of someone who believed they were negotiating from a position of complete information. She was asking for the house, 60% of the joint accounts, and spousal support based on the lifestyle they had assessed as our standard of living. It was aggressive but not unreasonable given the picture they had constructed. Based on what they thought they knew, it was actually close to what any competent attorney would advise. Based on what they actually did not know, it was the opening bid in a negotiation they did not yet understand they were losing. I put the demand letter in my file, and I drove to the deposition in my sensible car, and I wore a forgettable suit, and I walked into the conference room on the 14th floor where Gerald Marsh was waiting with 2 associates and a court reporter, and the particular posture of a man who has done this 100 times and expects today to be unremarkable. He expected, I could see it in the arrangement of his papers, a brief morning. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a downtown office building, with windows that looked out over the city in the gray, flat way of a March morning that had not decided yet whether to rain. There was a long table. Gerald Marsh sat on one side with his 2 associates, both young, both with the careful blankness of people paid to project competence they are still acquiring. The court reporter sat at the end. Patricia sat beside me. I had one folder with me. One. Marsh had an accordion file that was visibly full, the organized abundance of a man demonstrating preparation. My single folder was thin, deliberately thin, thin in the way of things that are precise rather than comprehensive. Patricia had counseled me on the optics of this. Sometimes, she said, the most powerful thing you can bring to a room is less than the other side expects. Marsh opened with the professional pleasantness that experienced litigators deploy in depositions, the kind that is courteous on the surface and entirely strategic beneath it. He established the procedural framework, confirmed the recording, reminded everyone of the legal obligations of disclosure. He was smooth and practiced, and had the faint air of someone who is going through motions he has gone through so many times they have become almost physical memory. Then he began. The early questions were standard. Background questions, timeline questions, questions about the marriage and its chronology that were more about establishing the record than gathering information. I answered them clearly and completely. I have never had difficulty with honesty when honesty is what is required. I simply choose, with care, what honesty requires the volunteering of and what it permits the withholding of until the correct moment. He moved to finances. He asked about my income. I told him. He asked about the business. I described it accurately, the consulting practice I had operated for 14 years, its general structure, its client base at a high level. He took notes with the efficiency of someone recording confirmation of what he already knew. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for. He asked it in the particular casual way that experienced attorneys use for the questions they consider important, a slightly lowered energy, as if the question is less significant than the ones around it. He asked, "Do you have any assets, holdings, properties, or financial interests beyond those you have described and those identified in the joint marital financial records?" I said, "Yes." The energy in the room changed. Not dramatically, nothing as visible as a reaction. But there was a microsecond of something in Marsh's face, a very small recalibration, before his professional composure reasserted itself. He said, "Please describe those assets." I reached into my single folder. I removed one card. It was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The summary document that Patricia and I had prepared, the one-page overview of what Patricia had taken to calling, between us, the full picture. I placed it on the table and I slid it across to Marsh. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it. I watched him read it. I had the time to watch him read it because reading it took longer than he had expected, because there was more on it than he had expected, because the number at the bottom of the page was not $400,000 or anything close to it. His two associates could not see the document from their angle, but they could see his face, and I watched them watching his face, and I watched the information travel from the document to his expression in the particular way of something that requires significant internal management before it can be shown to the room. When he looked up, he was composed. He was professional. He was good at his job. But he had gone, in the space of reading one folded page, several shades paler than he had been when he picked it up. And his eyes, when they met mine across the table, had in them something I recognized from my years in business, the look of someone who has just understood that they have been negotiating in a room they did not have the full map of. "I'll need some time to review this," he said. "Of course," I said. "Let me tell you what was on that page." I had started my consulting practice 14 years earlier, in the second year of my marriage, with a client base of 4 and a spare bedroom that served as an office. The practice had grown steadily, not explosively, not in the way of things that attract attention and coverage and the social visibility that Claudia valued, but solidly, in the way of a business built on reputation and referrals and the kind of work that clients do not discuss publicly because it involves their own financial architecture and they prefer their own discretion. As the practice generated revenue, I had reinvested it carefully. Not into lifestyle, into assets. Real estate, first, starting with a commercial property in a secondary market where prices were modest and the fundamentals were sound, purchased through an LLC that was properly filed and documented and entirely invisible to anyone who had not looked for it because no one had looked for it. then a second property, then a third, in a different market. The portfolio had grown over 9 years to 7 properties, 5 commercial, 2 residential, with a combined value, at current market assessment, that I will not state precisely here, but that was substantially north of $3 million. There were also the investment accounts. Not the joint accounts that Marsh had identified. Those were straightforward and expected. The investment accounts I had opened in the practice's early years, contributed to systematically, and grown through a combination of index investing and several concentrated positions in companies I had understood well enough to buy early and hold long. These accounts were in my name individually, predating the marriage in their original form, with contributions that Patricia had carefully categorized in terms of their marital and premarital components. There was the stake in a former client's company, a software firm I had consulted for in the practice's 3rd year, whose founder had offered equity in lieu of a portion of my fee, which I had accepted because I had understood his product better than he had understood that I understood it. That stake had been diluted through funding rounds, but had also appreciated with the company's growth, and its current value was a number that would have surprised Claudia very much. There was the intellectual property, proprietary frameworks and methodologies I had developed over the years of the practice, which had their own assessed value as assets of the business. There was the practice itself, valued as a going concern. The total, across all of it, when Patricia and our financial expert had completed the assessment, sat at approximately $6.2 million. Against Gerald Marsh's preliminary estimate of $400,000. Against the assumption of a modest man with a sensible car and forgettable clothes and no significant assets. I want to be clear about something important. None of this was hidden in the sense of being concealed from legal view. Every entity was properly registered. Every account was documented. Every property was titled correctly. Every tax return had been filed and every dollar had been reported to the appropriate authorities. The structures existed not to hide wealth, but to hold it in the ways that made the most legal and financial sense, and they were structures that anyone who had looked carefully at the right records would have found. Marsh had not looked carefully because he had not believed there was anything to find. He had built his strategy on an assumption, and assumptions are not due diligence. What happened after he read the summary sheet was, from a legal and strategic standpoint, entirely predictable to Patricia, who had navigated these waters many times. Marsh requested a recess. He got on the phone. I did not hear the call, but I could see him through the glass partition of the small room he stepped into, and his body language was the body language of a man delivering news that is not welcome. He was on the phone for 19 minutes. When he came back, his posture had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood what had preceded them. The deposition continued. He asked the follow-up questions that the document required him to ask. I answered them fully and patiently, walking him through each asset category, each entity, each account. Patricia sat beside me and said very little because very little needed to be said. The document had said it. The numbers had said it. The only remaining work was a methodical process of Marsh understanding the full dimensions of the room he had walked into without a proper map. By the end of the deposition, he had the map. It was a much larger room than he had thought. The call from Marsh's office came 3 days after the deposition. Not from Marsh directly. From one of his associates, the older of the two who had been in the room, who had clearly been tasked with making the initial contact and who performed this task with the particular strained professionalism of someone delivering a message they had not written. They wanted to talk about settlement. Patricia and I met to discuss strategy. This is the moment, she told me, where people often make the mistake of overcorrecting, of using the newly revealed information as a hammer, of letting the discovery that you have more power than the other side assume translate into an aggressive posture that extends the process and increases the cost and ultimately serves no one well except the attorneys. She said this matter-of-factly, not as a warning but as information, and I heard it in the spirit in which it was offered. I was not interested in using this as a hammer. I was interested in a fair resolution, fair in the actual sense, not in the weaponized sense that Gerald Marsh had deployed the word when he filed those initial documents. Fair meaning, appropriate to the reality of our actual situation, protective of Maya's stability and continuity, honest about what had been built and over what period and with whose contribution. This last point was the legally significant one. Claudia had not built most of what I had built. She had not been involved in the practice, had not participated in the investment decisions, had not contributed to the real estate acquisitions. The life we had shared had been funded by what I made, the joint accounts, the household expenses, the vacations and the dinners and the visible architecture of our life together, and those shared assets were what they were, and I was entirely prepared to divide them as equitably as the law required. The premarital investment accounts were mine. The 7 properties, purchased during the marriage and therefore subject to more complex analysis, required the careful assessment that Patricia and our financial expert had already completed, the contribution analysis, the appreciation tracing, the documentation of source funds. Some portion of the property portfolio was potentially marital. The calculation of that portion was precise and defensible and significantly less than Marsh had implied in his initial demands, when he had not known the portfolio existed. We sat across a different table from Marsh 2 weeks after the deposition. He had prepared. He had brought his own financial expert. He had clearly spent the intervening 2 weeks doing the due diligence he had not done before filing. He was more careful now, more precise, more, I want to use the right word, respectful, not in a personal sense but in the sense of someone who has recalibrated the weight of what they are dealing with. I let Patricia lead most of the negotiation. I was present and attentive and available for direct questions, but the tactical work was hers, and she was very good at it. She had prepared positions on every asset category, supported by documentation that was complete and organized in the way of things that have been properly maintained over many years rather than assembled for the purpose of litigation. What Claudia received in the final settlement was this: the house, which we agreed to sell with the equity divided in a proportion that reflected our respective contributions to the mortgage and maintenance over the years. Her full share of the genuine joint accounts and retirement savings. A spousal support arrangement of limited duration, appropriate to her earning capacity and the length of the marriage, and a one-time payment that reflected the marital component of the property portfolio. A number that was meaningful and that I paid without grievance, because it was the correct number, arrived at honestly. What she did not receive was the house outright with 60% of everything else and open-ended support, and the implicit assumption that she was entitled to assets she had not known existed and had not contributed to building. What she received was what was fair. What I retained was the practice, the investment accounts, the majority of the property portfolio, and the stake in the software company, which, as it happened, received a significant acquisition offer 14 months after the settlement close, at a number that made the entire preceding 18 months of legal process feel, in purely financial terms, entirely manageable. Maya came to live primarily with me. This was not a battle I had anticipated winning, and I do not frame it as a win. She is not a prize in a competition. She is a child who needed stability and who, in the assessment of the family evaluator, had it more consistently in my home than in her mother's. Claudia has generous visitation and exercises it, and Maya is, at 9, adapting to the changed landscape of her family with the particular resilience of children who are loved well by both of their parents even when those parents cannot love each other any more. On the day the settlement was signed, Marsh shook my hand across the conference table. He was professional about it. He is, underneath the aggressive strategy and the misread situation, a competent attorney who had simply encountered incomplete information and built too confidently upon it. I shook his hand, and I said nothing memorable, and I walked out into the afternoon with Patricia beside me, and she said, "How do you feel?" "Like it's over," I said. "It is," she said. We stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment in the afternoon light. The city moved around us in its ordinary way: taxis, pedestrians, the ambient noise of a place that does not adjust itself for the significant moments of individual lives. I had spent 18 months in a legal process that had consumed time and money and emotional energy, and the ordinary world had continued throughout, as it always does. I thought about the single folded page, the one card on the table. The moment Marsh had unfolded it and read it and gone pale in the careful, professional way of a man trying not to show what he was feeling. I had not placed that card to humiliate him. I had placed it because it was the truth, and the truth was required, and sometimes the truth arrives in rooms where it is unexpected and changes everything about what the room had believed was happening. That is all I had done. I had told the truth, fully, at the correct moment. There is a question people ask when I tell this story, and it is this: why did you never tell her? It is a fair question. 11 years is a long time to maintain a gap between what someone believes about you and what is actually true. I do not have a simple answer. Part of it is the nature I described at the beginning, the disinterest in visibility, the preference for architecture over decoration. Part of it is a particular privacy that serious wealth building requires, a privacy that becomes habitual and is hard to selectively dismantle in the context of a marriage. Part of it, and I want to be honest about this part because it is not comfortable, is that I had understood on some level that Claudia's interest in me was partly entangled with her assessment of what I had, and I had not wanted to test what happened to the interest when the assessment changed. That last part is its own kind of failure, and I have sat with it. What I understand now, on the other side of all of it, is that the invisibility I had cultivated as a professional strategy had become a personal habit, and personal habits applied to marriages produce gaps that fill with assumption. Claudia's assumption had been wrong, but it had grown in a space I had left open for it. I do not excuse what she did. The 6 weeks of secret legal preparation, the Gerald Marsh approach, the attempt to take what was not hers to take. But I can see, more clearly than I could in the middle of it, the conditions in which her misunderstanding had been able to form and persist. I am not going to make the same mistake again. Not out of guilt. Guilt is not a useful long-term operating principle, but out of the understanding that genuine partnership requires actual transparency, not just the absence of lies. There is a lot of space between lying and being fully known, and I had lived in that space for 11 years and called it privacy, and it had cost me a marriage that might, had it been built differently, have been worth keeping. Maya is growing up watching a father who is learning, at 43, to let people see more of what is actually there. This is slower work than building a property portfolio. It requires different instruments. But the discipline is the same. You do it carefully, over time, with full attention to the foundation. The rest, eventually, follows. The most dangerous assumption in any negotiation, personal, professional, or legal, is the one you make before you have looked carefully. The man in the sensible car may be driving it because he understands the difference between what something costs and what it is worth. Look carefully. Always look carefully.